The file landed on Ethan's desk with a soft thud. He stared at it, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. Years of searching, years of dead ends, false leads, and sleepless nights. And now, here it was. The answer he'd been chasing for decades. Ethan opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside was a single photograph. A woman in her late 50s, wearing a faded apron, serving coffee at a small-town diner. Her face was older, lined with time, but there was no mistaking those eyes. They were the same eyes that used to tuck him into bed, the same eyes that smiled at him when the world felt too big and scary. It was her, his mother, alive. Ethan clenched the edge of his desk, his mind racing. How could this be? After all these years, she was just working as a waitress? No explanation, no word, nothing. Just gone. And now found again. He booked the first flight to the tiny town where she lived. As the plane soared above the clouds, Ethan wrestled with his emotions. Anger bubbled inside him. Why did she leave? Did she even care about him anymore? But beneath the anger was something else. Hope. Fragile, flickering hope that maybe, just maybe, they could fix what was broken. When he arrived, Ethan parked his car a block away from the diner. He wasn't ready to approach her yet. Not like this. Instead, he watched through the window as she moved between tables, refilling cups and chatting with customers. She looked happy, or at least content. But why? Why had she chosen this life over him? Ethan took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. Whatever answers she had, he was going to get them. Tonight, because after 25 years, he deserved the truth. The diner was quiet by the time closing hour arrived. Ethan sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He'd spent hours watching her, his mother, move gracefully between tables, laughing softly with customers and wiping down counters. Felt surreal, like staring at a ghost from another life. Finally, the last customer left, and the neon open sign flickered off. Ethan stepped out of the car, his legs heavy with nerves. He walked to the door and knocked softly. A moment later, she appeared. Her face was tired but kind as she opened the door, squinting against the dim light. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice warm yet cautious. Then she saw him, really saw him. Her hand flew to her mouth, and for a second, she froze. "Ethan?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He nodded, unable to speak. His throat felt tight, like someone had wrapped an iron band around it. "Oh my God!" she breathed, tears welling up in her eyes. She reached out hesitantly, as if afraid he might disappear. "Is it really you?" "It's me, Mom," he managed to choke out. She pulled him into a hug before he could react, holding him so tightly it took his breath away. For a moment, Ethan let himself sink into it. The warmth, the familiarity, the love he'd buried deep inside for years. But then reality crashed back in, and he gently pulled away. "Why?" he asked, his voice raw. "Why did you leave? Do you have any idea what it was like for me?" Clara flinched, guilt flashing across her face. "I wanted to tell you everything," she said, her voice breaking. "But I couldn't. I thought I was protecting you." "Protecting me from what?" Ethan demanded, anger bubbling beneath the surface. She gestured for him to sit at one of the booths. Reluctantly, he slid into the cracked vinyl seat as she joined him on the other side. "It started with your father," she began, her hands clasped tightly together. "After he died, I found out about debts. Dangerous people he owed money to. They came after me, Ethan. They threatened to hurt you if I didn't leave. I had no choice. I thought staying away was the only way to keep you safe." Ethan stared at her, stunned. All these years, he'd assumed she abandoned him, that she didn't care. But now, hearing her story, he felt something shift inside him. "So you just disappeared?" he asked, his voice softer this time. "I sent letters," she admitted, "every week for years. But they must have been intercepted. I never heard back from you." Ethan leaned back, overwhelmed. Was it possible? Had she tried to reach him all along? "I don't know what to say," he admitted finally. You don't have to say anything, Clara replied, reaching across the table to take his hand. Just knowing you're okay. That's enough for me. For the first time in years, Ethan felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe they could fix this. Maybe they still had a chance. The diner felt smaller now, its familiar creaks and smells wrapping around Ethan like a blanket he wasn't sure he wanted. He watched his mother as she busied herself tidying up, stacking chairs, wiping down tables, and turning off the coffee machine. Her movements were slow but deliberate, each action carrying the weight of years spent in quiet survival. You don't have to do that, Ethan said finally, breaking the silence. Let me help. Clara glanced at him, surprised by the offer, then shook her head with a faint smile. It's okay. It's what I do. Ethan frowned, looking around the worn-out space. The peeling wallpaper, the cracked tiles, the faded menu board. It all seemed so far removed from the life he lived. How could she be content here? After everything she'd been through, didn't she deserve more? Why didn't you ever try to find me again? He asked, his tone softer but still probing. Clara paused, leaning against the counter. I thought about it every day, she admitted. But after those first few years, when my letters went unanswered, I convinced myself you were better off without me, that you'd moved on, built your own life. But I didn't, Ethan said sharply, regretting the edge in his voice almost immediately. I spent years wondering where you were, if you were even alive. I'm sorry, Clara whispered, tears pooling in her eyes. I never meant for you to feel abandoned. Leaving you was the hardest thing I've ever done. Ethan looked away, guilt twisting in his chest. For so long, he'd imagined her living some carefree life while he struggled alone. But seeing her now, in this tiny diner, wearing an apron patched too many times, he realized how wrong he'd been. I want to make things right, he said suddenly. Come live with me. Let me take care of you. Clara hesitated, her expression conflicted. Ethan, I appreciate it truly, but this is my home now, my life. I don't know if I can just walk away from it. You shouldn't have to live like this, Ethan insisted. You deserve better. It's not about what I deserve, Clara replied gently. It's about peace, stability. I've worked hard for this little corner of happiness, and I'm scared of losing it. Her words hit him harder than he expected. She wasn't rejecting him. She was protecting herself. And maybe, in her own way, she was trying to protect him too. I won't push you, Ethan said quietly. But please let me stay a while. Get to know you again. Clara nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. I'd like that. For the first time in decades, Ethan felt like he had a chance to rebuild something precious. Something worth fighting for. The next morning, Ethan woke up early and headed to the diner. Clara was already there, flipping on lights and humming softly to herself. She looked up as he entered, her face lighting up with a smile that still felt unfamiliar yet achingly familiar at the same time. Good morning, she said, pouring him a cup of coffee without asking. Sleep well. Ethan nodded, though his mind was racing. He hadn't slept much. Instead, he'd spent hours poring over old files from the investigators, piecing together fragments of her story. The more he learned, the clearer it became. The people who had forced her to leave weren't just part of their past. They were still out there. Mom, he began, sitting down at the counter. I need to ask you something. Clara paused, sensing the seriousness in his tone. What is it? Those men, the ones who threatened you after Dad died. Do you think they're still looking for you? Her hands stilled on the coffee pot, and for a moment, she didn't answer. Then, quietly, she said, I don't know. I've tried not to think about it. But sometimes, she trailed off, glancing toward the window as if expecting someone to appear. Sometimes what? Ethan pressed gently. Sometimes I feel like I'm being watched, she admitted. Like someone's always one step behind me. But I tell myself it's paranoia. It has to be. It's not paranoia, Ethan said firmly. They're still out there. And if they find you... He couldn't finish the sentence. Clara sighed, setting the coffee pot aside. Ethan, I've lived with this fear for 25 years. Running isn't an option anymore. I'm too tired to run. Well, you don't have to, Ethan replied, determination hardening his voice. This time we fight back. Clara stared at him, alarmed. No, absolutely not. I won't let you put yourself in danger because of me. It's not just about you, Ethan countered. It's about us. About making sure no one can hurt you or anyone else ever again. She opened her mouth to argue but stopped when she saw the resolve in his eyes. For the first time, she realized how much he'd grown. Not just into a man, but into someone capable of protecting the people he loved. Okay, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. But promise me one thing. What? That we do this together. Ethan nodded, relief washing over him. Together, they began digging deeper into her past, uncovering connections between her late husband's debts and a shadowy organization that operated under the radar. Each clue brought them closer to the truth and closer to danger. One evening, as they pored over documents in the diner's back room, Clara froze. Ethan, look outside, she whispered. He turned to see a black car parked across the street, its engine idling. Two figures sat inside, their faces obscured by shadows. They're here, Clara murmured, gripping the edge of the table. Ethan stood, his jaw tightening. Then it's time we ended this. The black car remained parked across the street for hours, its presence a silent but menacing reminder of the danger lurking in their lives. Ethan tried to act normal, helping Clara clean up the diner while keeping one eye on the window. But inside, his mind was racing. Who were these people? And how had they found her after all these years? That night, back at the small motel where he was staying, Ethan called his most trusted advisor, Greg. Greg had been by his side since the early days of building his empire, loyal, dependable, and always 2 steps ahead. If anyone could help him dismantle this threat, it was Greg. I need you to dig into something for me, Ethan said over the phone, his voice low. A name, Victor Kane. There was a pause on the other end. Kane? Greg repeated, his tone unusually sharp. Why are you looking into him? He's tied to my mom's past, Ethan explained. I think he might be behind the people watching us. Another pause, longer this time. When Greg spoke again, his voice was calm but measured. Ethan, listen carefully. You don't want to go down this road. Trust me. It's not worth it. What aren't you telling me? Ethan demanded, suspicion creeping into his voice. Nothing, Greg replied quickly. Too quickly. Just let it go. Focus on your business. Leave the past where it belongs. The call ended abruptly, leaving Ethan staring at his phone, unease settling in his chest. Something about Greg's reaction didn't sit right. Over the next few days, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Not just by the men outside the diner, but by someone closer to home. He started noticing strange inconsistencies. Missed calls from Greg that weren't logged, unfamiliar cars tailing him during his drives, and encrypted files on his server that he didn't recognize. Then came the breakthrough, or rather, the betrayal. While reviewing financial records late one night, Ethan discovered a series of unauthorized transfers linked to Victor Kane's organization. The transactions originated from accounts managed by none other than Greg. Ethan's blood ran cold. All this time, the man he'd trusted most, the man who'd helped build his empire, was working against him. Confronting Greg wasn't easy, but Ethan knew he had no choice. He arranged a meeting under the pretense of discussing new investments. You've been funneling money to Kane, Ethan accused, slamming the evidence onto the table between them. Greg hesitated, then sighed, his shoulders slumping in defeat. It's not what you think. Explain it to me, then, Ethan snapped, his fists clenched. It started years ago, Greg admitted reluctantly. Kane approached me when we were still struggling. He offered funding with strings attached. I thought I could control it, keep it separate from you. But now it's spiraling out of control, Ethan finished bitterly. And my mom is caught in the middle because of your greed. I never meant for any of this to happen, Greg pleaded. I swear, Ethan, I was trying to protect you. By lying to me? Ethan shot back, his voice rising. By putting her life at risk? Greg looked away, guilt etched across his face. Ethan stood, his decision clear. You're done. Out of my company, out of my life. And if you so much as breathe near my mother again, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what you've done. As Greg left the room, Ethan sank into his chair, anger and betrayal swirling inside him. This wasn't just about protecting Clara anymore. It was about dismantling everything Kane and his network represented. And Ethan was ready to burn it all down. The betrayal hit Ethan like a punch to the gut, but it also ignited something inside him. A fire he hadn't felt in years. For so long, he'd built his empire on cold calculations, ruthless decisions, and an unshakable focus on success. But now, staring at the ruins of trust scattered around him, he realized how hollow that success had been without love, loyalty, or purpose. He called Clara immediately, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. We need to talk, he said simply. When they met at the diner later that evening, Ethan laid everything bare. The unauthorized transfers, Greg's involvement, and the extent of Kane's reach. Clara listened quietly, her expression unreadable until he finished. So what happens now? She asked softly. We take them down, Ethan replied, determination hardening his voice. Together. Clara nodded, though fear flickered in her eyes. I trust you, Ethan, but promise me one thing. You won't lose yourself in this fight. Her words struck a chord deep within him. She wasn't just talking about defeating Kane. She was reminding him not to let hatred consume him. Over the next few weeks, Ethan worked tirelessly, using every resource at his disposal to dismantle Kane's network. He hired private investigators, cybersecurity experts, and even reached out to former allies who owed him favors. With each step forward, he grew more confident, not just in his ability to protect Clara, but in his newfound understanding of what truly mattered. Through it all, Clara remained by his side, offering quiet strength and wisdom. She reminded him to breathe, to rest, to remember why they were fighting in the first place. Slowly but surely, their bond deepened, healing wounds neither of them had realized were still raw. One night, as they sat together in the diner after hours, Ethan looked at her and smiled. A genuine smile, free of the weight that had burdened him for so long. Thank you, he said quietly. For what? Clara asked, raising an eyebrow. For teaching me how to be better, he admitted. For showing me what really matters. Clara reached across the table, squeezing his hand. You've always had it in you, Ethan. You just needed someone to remind you. As dawn broke over the horizon, Ethan felt a sense of peace he hadn't known was possible. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, he faced it with clarity and hope. The final confrontation came on a rainy Tuesday morning. Armed with evidence of Kane's illegal activities, Ethan handed over the dossier to federal authorities. Within hours, raids were conducted across multiple cities, dismantling the organization piece by piece. Victor Kane was arrested, his empire crumbling under the weight of corruption charges. Ethan stood outside the courthouse as reporters swarmed around him, shouting questions about his involvement in bringing down one of the most notorious crime syndicates in decades. But he didn't care about the headlines or the accolades. All that mattered was the woman waiting for him back at the diner. When he returned, Clara greeted him with a knowing smile. It's over, isn't it? She asked softly. It's over, Ethan confirmed, pulling her into a tight embrace. For the first time in 25 years, Clara felt truly safe. The constant fear that had shadowed her life melted away, replaced by a sense of freedom she hadn't dared to dream of. I think it's time I made some changes, she said after a moment. Like what? Ethan asked, curious. I want to move closer to you, Clara admitted. Maybe find a little apartment nearby. Start fresh. Ethan's heart swelled with gratitude. I'd like that. Together, they packed up her belongings from the small-town diner, leaving behind a chapter of her life, but not its lessons. In the city, Clara settled into a quieter existence, volunteering at community centers and mentoring young women trying to escape abusive situations. Meanwhile, Ethan transformed his company culture, prioritizing ethics and transparency over profit margins. He established a foundation in Clara's name, dedicated to helping families torn apart by violence and exploitation rebuild their lives. As months turned into years, Ethan found himself happier than he'd ever been, not because of wealth or power, but because of the connection he'd rekindled with his mother. 1 year later, Ethan stood at the podium of a grand ballroom, addressing a crowd gathered for the inaugural gala of the Clara Bennett Foundation. The room buzzed with energy as beneficiaries, donors, and volunteers shared stories of hope and resilience. Ethan glanced toward the back of the room, where Clara sat surrounded by newfound friends, women she'd mentored, children she'd helped, and even some of the diner's regulars who had traveled to celebrate her journey. She looked radiant, her eyes shining with pride and contentment. "None of this would have been possible without my mother," Ethan said into the microphone, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "She taught me that true wealth isn't measured in dollars or deals. It's measured in love, trust, and the lives we touch." The audience erupted into applause as Clara rose from her seat, waving modestly. Later, during a quiet moment on the balcony overlooking the city lights, Ethan joined her. "You've done so much good," he said, leaning against the railing. "We both have," Clara corrected gently. "And there's still more to do." Ethan smiled, nodding in agreement. For the first time in his life, he felt whole. Not because he'd conquered an empire or defeated a villain, but because he'd found something far greater: purpose. As they stood together under the starlit sky, Ethan realized the past year hadn't just been about redemption. It had been about rediscovery. Rediscovering family, values, and the beauty of second chances. And as long as they had each other, nothing else mattered.